Today, I'd like to welcome you here. GAIA is a global network of grassroots and national organizations from 92 countries around the world, and we work together on waste and environmental justice. Our members have deep expertise in the field, and we are strongly rooted, and they are strongly rooted in their communities and their countries. GAIA was founded in 2000 in South Africa by activists working on waste and justice in 23 countries. Next slide. Thank you. We have an environmental justice agenda that we have set on batteries. My name is Lien Brouckere, and I bring together GAIA's work across the 5 regions in the world in which we work, where we determine our work in line with the zero waste hierarchy that you see shown here. Batteries, whether this is for primarily electric vehicles and also stationary storage, are central to realizing the energy transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy sources. The path to net zero is one that requires a massive increase in overall battery storage. About 90% of that demand is driven by vehicles, electric vehicles. These batteries are produced using, thousands of 350,000 synthetic chemicals that are on the market today. These chemicals are not well understood, not well inventoried, or publicly reported. And so of greatest concern among these especially is a certain category called PFAS, which our presenters will be speaking to today. And so our goal really in what we're trying to do is to see how can we, in this period of innovation and growth, integrate, ensure that sustainability and environmental justice are integrated in the whole life cycle of these batteries, so that we can prioritize the levels of interventions and policies and financing and drive innovation that supports a just transition, ensuring no communities are left behind while we're advancing climate solutions. So the agenda, if we could go to the next slide, the agenda for today's presentation is we have 2 broad sessions. The first is 2 speakers will speak to protecting frontline communities from toxic materials in batteries. Sheila Davis will speak to battery manufacturing and recycling, chemical use, and transparency, primarily in federal tech hubs in the United States. And then Gartner from Earth Justice will speak to how we can use the law to protect the environment and frontline communities from these hazardous chemicals. Next, we will shift in the second session to a more positive solutions-oriented framing of what can we do about this. And this involves presentations from Dr. Mark Rossi from CPA, Chemical Production Action, who will speak to measuring the chemical footprint of batteries and a new and exciting battery chemical footprint index. And then Rajan, Dr. Krishna Rajan, who will speak to artificial intelligence and how can we accelerate innovation for safer chemicals and materials. So with that, we can run. So Sheila Davis will start. She is the battery waste coordinator at my colleague, leading our batteries work in the US and Canada for the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. Then we have Gartner, Director of Cross-Cutting Toxic Strategies at Earth Justice. Dr. Mark Rossi, as I said, Executive Director at Clean Production Action. And then last slide here is Krishna Rajan, who is Professor and Founding Chair of the Department of Materials Design and Innovation at the University of Buffalo. So with that, I would love to invite Sheila to now present for the first opening panel session, and I will share your slides for you, Sheila, starting that now. Does everybody see those slides? Wonderful, great.
Great.
Sheila.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's really nice to be here and to begin this conversation really about chemicals in battery manufacturing, recycling throughout the life cycle, and how they impact communities and how we can change the trajectory from what we've seen previously with um, high-tech manufacturing and some of the impacts. If you want to go to the next slides, Lien. So I'm really going to focus on, or just briefly touch on, I should say, like these 5 different issues, looking at what are these new federal regional battery tech hubs, and what's the legacy of pollution in tech hubs in the US? And then, of course, look at some of the battery recycling facility chemical use and just kind of hone in on PFAS use. And then really briefly touch on public disclosure and transparency, and then environmental data justice. You want to go to the next slide? So just starting off with the regional tech hubs, and the federal government has basically developed tech hubs in different renewable energy sectors like hydrogen, solar, et cetera. And they've designated these tech hubs, which means that they're really focusing investments in the tech hubs as well as resources. And there's 4 battery tech hubs. Many of you might be familiar with them. One is the Battery Belt, which is basically in the Midwest to the South. There's at least 8 states, Minnesota, Indiana, all the way to South Carolina, that are all part of this Battery Belt Tech Hub that is in the East Coast for the most part in the South. And it really includes automakers as well as battery manufacturers and battery recyclers. And then there's the Nevada Lithium Loop, our lithium battery and other EV material loop, which actually includes several counties in Southern California, including Imperial County, Riverside County, and San Bernardino County. It really focuses on the extraction from regional lithium brine deposits in the region and what they're calling Lithium Valley. Of course, and then there's the New York, which is then focuses really on battery research and job development. And those are like the 4 central tech hubs. And I think it's important, if you go to the next slide, Lien, to look at the actual investments. There's probably, I'm sorry, a decimal point is in the wrong place. It's closer to $90 billion that has been invested by the Biden administration, and more than 170 new expanded EV and assembly and battery components and battery manufacturing and recycling facilities, and over 300 new or expanded mineral material processing and extraction facilities. If you want to go to the next slide. And I think it's really important that when you look at the language that's been used by the Biden administration in terms of identifying and clustering these industrial activities, and they're referring to it as onshoring the battery industry. And I think it's really important to understand some of the impacts of when you have clusters, but also why the Biden administration actually is referring to it as onshoring. That means that there was at one time offshoring, and there was a reason for that offshoring of tech manufacturing. Um, Here we already see some of the impacts from batteries in terms of fires that have occurred. For example, in Detroit, there's been over 8 fires in like the last 8 months or so. There's been major chemical spills at a plant in Ohio with a very serious solvent, and Eve will give you a little bit more information about that. Go to the next slide. But first, I want to talk to you about basically the legacy of pollution in tech hubs. And it really started, if you look at Silicon Valley, which was kind of the original tech hub. And initially, everybody thought it was clean and pristine. All the campuses were green and the lawns, rolling hills and whatnot. Um, and it was called clean tech or clean industry. But back in 1981, there's discovery of industrial chemical leaks from underground chemical storage tanks from IBM, um, Fairchild, several other big manufacturers that are known today. And basically, it was trichloroethane that was leaking, along with acetane and some other chemicals. And the community didn't even know, nor did the manufacturers know that the underground storage tanks were leaking. Of course, the chemicals, you couldn't smell them or taste them, but they start turning up in the communities with elevated rates of miscarriages, as well as elevated rates of cancer in the region. And one of the themes that of tech hubs or these hubs is that the communities actually have to have gone and done their own research to collect their own data. And that's what the community did to determine that they were experiencing some adverse impacts. Basically, Silicon Valley was also one of the first regions to actually model community right to know laws, local laws, as a result of this type of contamination. But if you go to the next slide, there really is a theme to clusters of industries, especially with electronics and what we would refer to as high tech. But I'm here really speaking about electronics. And there have been efforts in California to implement green chemistry laws or green chemistry legislation. And there was a landmark study back in 2006 that really identified some of the key issues around environmental regulations and kind of the lack of protections and the data gaps that occurred in, of course, materials and understanding what material impacts are, the toxicity and monitoring, as well as the technology gaps and the safety gaps and the lack of coordinated policy, publicly available information, which we're also just seeing right now in some of the regions, like in Nevada. If you go to the next slide. And if you look at the, excuse me, the recycling processes, PFAS, for example, it's similar to TCA or trichloroethane. You can't smell it, you can't see it, but it's everywhere in the environment. It has adverse impact not only on human health and on water and on soil, and it's called a forever chemical because it doesn't leave the environment. And of course, it is throughout not only battery manufacturing processes, but also included in electronic manufacturing. So throughout the battery manufacturing system and life cycle, you actually have PFAS release. And just really quickly looking at the recycling steps with pre-treatment, there's sorting and deactivation and dismantling or shredding. There is release of PFAS potentially in that step through the air into the water. The batteries use electrolytes and binders to in the manufacturing and in the batteries products itself. And in order to remove those materials, you have to either subject it to some low or high heat. And there's really not well understood pathways of exposure for the PFAS that burns off. And then, of course, in the black mass, it also, which is developed or created in this process of crushing and shredding the batteries. And then it's subjected to, again, heat through the hydrometallurgy process with chemicals, many solvents, and there's not very clear information on how these chemicals are transformed, what kind of water impacts it has in terms of it uses a lot of water, or any of the PFAS released into the water or the air. If you go to the next slide. And some of the problems is because just like trichloroethane 40 years ago, PFAS is not well regulated. Um, everything, communities really are not informed about what's happening, not through the NEPA process. There's no environmental impact reports that are available for most of these battery recycling facilities. The toxic inventory release data, because these are startups, again, just like 40 years ago with electronics, you could not, they weren't regulated, and a lot of the materials weren't regulated, and they didn't initially meet the threshold as a startup for actually capturing in the information. And of course, at that time, there wasn't even really a TRI. And then, of course, PFAS is not very well regulated. There's now, I guess, 200 PFAS chemicals that are actually regulated, but it's really towards drinking water. If you're not using the water initially for drinking, if it goes through other processes and it's released, it's not really within that context of the Nevada Lithium Loop. It's really not being monitored or tracked. And then, of course, there's the issue of proprietary information. Some of the recyclers have already requested confidentiality of the air emissions. And then, of course, the different states have different air emission requirements. The end of the next slide. So all those issues really lead to communities still not having, after many years, the data that they need to protect their health. And it really does present a data justice challenge where to communities where the data is either there's data by omission, there's not enough data, or it's not the right type of data that communities can really determine what are the impacts. And of course, disadvantaged communities, communities of color, and low-income communities have an even more extraordinarily difficult time of accessing the data themselves, or else creating a system of monitoring the environment on their own. If you go to the next slide. Which is really becoming more of a common practice because communities can't get the data through the government, the companies aren't releasing the data for proprietary purposes. And so communities are really using their own knowledge, using equipment, monitoring equipment that has come down in price for example, air monitoring equipment and water monitoring equipment to protect their health. This has happened in Endicott, New York, of course, where there was a battery recycler that was being established there, and the community actually challenged them, not on monitoring, but just actually getting access to the permitting data, which isn't available in all states, but in New York it was, and they were able to identify that there were fluorinated chemicals that were potentially being released. So it's really becoming upon a burden upon communities to actually own their own data. If you go to the next slide. And so we really want to look at throughout the discussion and want this to be a smart discussion and an ongoing discussion, and with hopefully as many people as we could talk to as possible around how do we make sure the data is transparent, because everybody needs the data. The communities absolutely need the data. They will have to collect it on their own, but they also need to be able to get it from the companies. Consumers want the data. They want it to make decisions about their purchases. Workers need the data to protect their health. Go to the next slide. Governments, of course, need to be able to access data to regulate the environment properly, and recycling facilities need the data to know what's actually the material that they're actually recycling, what's in their feedstock, and then researchers need the data. So today we're going to talk to, of course, Krishna and Mark about how we can hold companies accountable and how we can also utilize some of this data to improve inputs, and he will talk about how we can actually access the information using the available regulatory system. So again, I hope this is just the beginning of a long conversation and how we change the trajectory on our system.
Thank you so much, Sheila. So much rich information there. And now I'd love to invite Eve, please, to start your presentation on how we can use the law to protect the frontline communities affected. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Lien, and thanks, Sheila, for that great introduction to an overview of this issue. So good morning, everyone. I'm Eve Gartner. I'm the Director of Cross-Cutting Toxic Strategies at Earth Justice. I'm very happy to be here with you today. Next slide, please. Great. So I just wanted to share a bit about Earth Justice. Earth Justice is, as many of you know, a national not-for-profit environmental law firm. We have 15 regional offices around the country doing the work of those regions primarily, and also multiple specialized programs, many of which are doing work that relates to EV batteries across their life cycle. And in general, we use the law to hold government and special interests accountable. Next slide, please. So, next slide. I plan to discuss provisions in federal law that are already on the books that can be used to ensure the collection and public dissemination of data regarding pollution from battery manufacturing and recycling facilities. If you can actually go back to the prior slide, that would be great. So these data can be used by communities to take steps to protect their health and safety, and they can also be used to advocate for regulations and standards that require reduced emissions and exposures. So data can also be used by scientists to figure out data gaps that need further study, and by regulators who are motivated to protect communities and workers. So sometimes right to know means the right to access information that already exists. And sometimes it means the right to require polluting industries or governments to actually develop data. And I plan to talk about some of both. In general, and as you know, Sheila really already has said this, there's lots of discussion about standards for making EV battery production and recycling efficient and carbon neutral and economically viable. And from my perspective, far too little discussion about the potential hazards of manufacturing and recycling batteries and the need to develop safety standards. We should change that, and having more information about toxic emissions and workplace hazards will help to elevate the concerns. Next slide, please. So the Toxics Release Inventory, which is sometimes referred to as the TRI, is the primary tool in federal law for obtaining information about any toxic chemical that is released into the environment from industrial sources. So let me explain briefly how the TRI works. The TRI program requires facilities in certain industrial sectors to submit toxic chemical release reports every year for listed toxic chemicals if the facility manufactures, processes, or uses the listed chemical or any listed chemical in a volume that exceeds a threshold established by EPA. If the reporting threshold is met based on the volume of manufacture, process, or use, then all releases from that facility of that chemical must be reported, whether the release is into air, water, soil, underground injection. And EPA uses these facility-specific reports to develop a searchable database. And the searches can be by facility, by chemical, by industry, all sorts of different ways to search the database. And that database is available on EPA's website. And we'll share the slides after the presentation, and in the notes section of my slides, I'll include links that you can use to access the database. So as I just said, and as this graphic in the slide makes clear, there are lots of boxes to check for TRI reporting to kick in. The facility must be in a covered sector, the chemical must be listed, the manufacture, process, and use must be above the threshold. So that might seem daunting. However, the TRI law, which is known as the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, allows communities to petition to expand reporting to new industrial sectors, to add new chemicals to the list that are reportable, and also to lower reporting thresholds. So this is a really important tool. And for some of these petitions, especially, and in particular, the petition to add new chemicals, EPA must respond to those petitions within 180 days. So again, it's an important tool. And battery manufacturing is already a covered industrial sector under the TRI. And frankly, I think it's a bit murky whether EV battery disposal and recycling facilities are a covered sector. I think some of the facilities are covered and some might not be. So that would be an excellent petition to submit. Some of the chemicals that are used in battery manufacture are definitely listed on the TRI. For example, NMP, the chemical that Sheila referenced that was part of a major spill in Ohio last year, that's listed on the TRI. Currently, there are about 200 PFAS listed on the TRI, and EPA has just proposed a rule to add another 300 PFAS. One of the good things about the PFAS on the TRI is the reporting threshold for them is pretty low. It's 100 pounds because they're all considered persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. And also, unfortunately, over the last few years, EPA has allowed companies to employ a de minimis exemption when calculating their thresholds for PFAS, but as a result of an Earth Justice lawsuit, EPA has eliminated that de minimis exemption starting next year. So we should begin to see more robust reporting next year. But again, not all chemicals used in battery recycling and manufacture are listed, but there is this option to add additional chemicals by petitioning the agency. And there's many successful examples of that. The Toxic Use Reduction Institute in Massachusetts petitioned to add 25 chemicals, and most of those were added. A group called the Toxic Free Future petitioned to add a phthalate chemical that was granted. And there's been multiple petitions to add different industrial sectors. CBD petitioned to add advanced recycling or so-called chemical recycling facilities to the TRI, and that's still pending. Environmental Integrity Project petition to add natural gas processing facilities, and that was recently granted. So those are just a few examples. I just want to give you the sense like many organizations are using this petition process successfully to get new chemicals and industrial sectors added to the TRI. So that's definitely something that we should be considering for EV battery related chemicals and facilities. Next slide, please. And so this is just a few examples of organizations, environmental organizations that are using TRI to develop data analyses and reports. There was a really good report from Environment America about just water pollution across the country. And Environmental Integrity Project did a great report about toxic discharges from oil and gas facilities, which actually was the precursor to a litigation that they filed. So again, those are just, this is a tool that is being utilized really effectively. Next slide, please. And there's also other sources of data on particular chemicals or chemical classes, such as PFAS, lithium, and chemicals that are undergoing review through the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. And I'll mention a few of those briefly. Next slide, please. So EPA has a particularly robust tools for understanding the data that's already been generated about PFAS. They have a portal on their website to a lot of PFAS data, including information about where drinking water is contaminated with PFAS, where there have been discharges into surface water. You're able to access the TRI data on PFAS through this one link that's shown in this slide. And also, there's really good information through this portal about waste generation, transfer, and disposal, PFAS-containing waste. That's also been used really effectively by a variety of groups to track waste containing PFAS through these RCRA manifest reports. So again, it's totally not perfect, but I think EPA's done a good job of consolidating the PFAS data into this one portal, and I urge folks to play around with that particular tool. One caveat that I think is important is that EPA uses a narrow and frankly unscientific definition of what is a PFAS chemical. So under EPA's working definition, one of the main PFAS that's used to make EV batteries, which is known as PVDF, is not actually categorized as a PFAS. And this isn't a coincidence. I mean, this is the result of intense industry lobbying to try to redefine what's a PFAS so that the spotlight, which is obviously on PFAS chemicals, doesn't shine brightly on some of the most critical PFAS chemicals, including those that are used in battery manufacturing, such as PVDF. So PVDF is a PFAS under the definition used by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, which is an intergovernmental organization with 38 member countries, but it's not covered by EPA's definition. And there is definitely ongoing advocacy on that that I welcome others to join. Next slide, please. So NMP, or N-methylpyrrolidone, is the chemical used in battery manufacturing that Sheila mentioned that was subject to a major spill in Ohio last year. This is a chemical that recently went through a very lengthy risk evaluation process under the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. As I hope you can see in this slide, I know it's a bit busy. EPA concluded that NMP presents unreasonable risk to workers, and in particular, that manufacturing lithium-ion batteries presents unreasonable risk to workers from exposure to NMP due to both acute and chronic hazards. And that's through both the inhalation and dermal routes of exposure. So under TSCA, once EPA finds a chemical presents unreasonable risks, it's supposed to adopt a rule that eliminates that risk, which is called a risk management rule. EPA proposed a risk management rule for NMP this summer, but it was really problematic in a few ways, especially with respect to lithium-ion battery manufacturing. EPA is proposing measures to protect against dermal exposure, but it totally fails to adopt any measures to protect workers from inhalation exposure to NMP in lithium-ion battery manufacture. Its excuse for this really unacceptable decision, which is really still a proposed decision, is that it relied on assertions from the battery manufacturing industry that use of NMP is always in a closed system where there's no chance of human exposure by inhalation, and therefore there's no need to adopt binding rules. Of course, nothing about this really makes sense. We know from the spill in Ohio that humans can be exposed to NMP and in the workplace as well. And even if it were true, that we would still need binding enforceable rules to make sure that it remains true. So the AFL-CIO submitted excellent comments documenting that there are, in fact, unsafe exposures to NMP in the workplace. EPA has not finalized this rule yet and will not do so before the administration changes. If we have a Harris administration, I think this would be a really important area for advocacy starting on day one, if not before. EPA should absolutely repropose a rule that provides meaningful workplace protections for workers in battery manufacture from this chemical NMP. One positive thing to note is that the risk evaluation and risk management rule dockets provide a vast amount of information about NMP's hazards and exposures. And so you could look at those dockets if you're interested in learning more about this, and I'll include links to those rulemaking dockets in the notes section of the slide. Next slide, please. So an obvious concern with lithium-ion batteries is that pollution can result in lithium contamination of water, including drinking water. We now have a lot of new information about the presence of lithium in drinking water around the country through a Safe Drinking Water Act program called the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, which or UCMR, which allows or requires certain unregulated contaminants to be tested in drinking water sources around the country over a 2-year period. Right now, the current cycle, EPA is requiring testing of drinking water for lithium and 29 specific PFAS chemicals. And so far, the results show that about 25% of public water systems in the country have lithium in their drinking water above health-based reference levels that EPA has established. So these reference levels they're not binding standards, but they're just levels that EPA has set for to help understand the meaning of this data that it's collecting. This process of monitoring unregulated contaminants could lead to the establishment of binding maximum contaminant levels in drinking water, especially if there's pressure on the agency to do that. So, for example, the binding drinking water limits for PFAS, for 7 PFAS that were adopted earlier this year, started with this kind of monitoring for those 7 PFAS a decade ago. And that led to concerted advocacy that culminated in the adoption of a rule a few months ago. So there is, again, this kind of monitoring can lead to binding standards, with continued pressure from communities. Next slide, please. And finally, I wanted to mention that the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act give EPA authority to collect information from polluters about water discharges and air emissions. So even if there's not rules in place regulating those contaminants or regulating particular facilities, EPA can request information in these information collection requests. And this is an advocacy tool that it uses fairly regularly, and getting this information can help draw attention to the need for even more information and ultimately for regulation. So my concluding message to you is that there are lots of tools in federal law to get more information about pollution from EV batteries across their life cycle. And there are also rulemaking processes that could result in stronger restrictions for these chemicals. And that it could also generate data about the substances. And I really strongly urge you to use these opportunities to file petitions, to engage in rulemaking processes by submitting comments, meeting with agency officials, attending public meetings, and organizing to encourage others to do the same. The battery manufacturing and semiconductor industry is doing an excellent job advocating for more money from the federal government and less regulation. We need to advocate for the idea that non-fossil energy is not clean if it means poisoning workers and communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eve. What an amazing call to action between what Sheila laid out and then the specific avenues that you've laid out under federal law. This is very exciting to see this come together, teed up. Again, I invite people to put questions in the chat. And now I'd love to invite, on a more positive note, continuing the call to action, where do we go from here? Mark, please, I turn it over to you to start your presentation. Thank you.
Great. It's great to be here with everyone. And are you seeing slides? Yes. Okay. Hopefully you're seeing a slide deck. Thanks, Lien. Great to be here with all of you today. As Lien said, I'm Mark Rossi. I'm the Executive Director of Clean Production Action. Clean Production Action is also a partner with the University at Buffalo, Krishna, Rajan, on the Collaboratory for a Regenerative Economy. And I saw, Krishna, that you had description of core in your slide deck, so I didn't add a description of the collaboratory for regenerative economy. And so the work that I'm going to be presenting today is part of the work with the collaborative for a regenerative economy. So overview of where I'm going to go in my presentation. I'm going to start with a short description of clean production action. Just wanted to then turn to, why we're doing this work around the chemical footprint project due to the global health and ecological crisis caused by toxic chemicals, which we've heard from Eve and Sheila on. And then I was going to do a deeper dive into the chemical footprint project survey, and then a chemical footprint index that we're working on of manufacturers of batteries using the renewable energy economy and the benefits of such an index. So that's the trajectory of the presentation. Just briefly on Clean Production Action, we're a nonprofit organization focused on advancing solutions to hazardous chemicals, and we do that through 4 programs. We have 2 collaborations that we run. One is with the investor community called the Investor Environmental Health Network. Another is a collaboration of businesses and nonprofit organizations called BizNGO. And then we have a framework for identifying safer chemicals and products called Green Screen. And then we have an initiative, the Chemical Footprint Project, which I'm going to say more about. So one thing, Eve and Sheila really highlighted, the costs and the hazards, and you're very familiar with them, of the use of toxic chemicals across the life cycle of products. And these were 2 articles that came out in 2022 around the planet, reaching the planetary boundaries for the exposure to and presence of toxic chemicals. And one was holistically around so-called novel entities, which are human-made chemicals that are not produced by the planet, and then the other around PFAS chemistries. And both of these articles and everything that Sheila and Eve were just talking about really just highlights the failure of our regulatory system, right? Our regulatory system is not adequately protecting us from the adverse health effects to toxic chemicals. Yes, of course, we need regulations, and yes, we want regulations to be stronger. So absolutely, we want that. But, in the meantime, what can we be doing to really drive companies beyond regulatory compliance, right? Regulatory compliance is the legal baseline for performance. But as we think about, and Sheila highlighted this nicely in her presentation, what consumers want, what workers need, what the investment community wants from companies that they're investing in, what governments should, are aspiring to in terms of driving companies to, is we want to move companies beyond regulatory compliance. And so we created the Chemical Footprint Project survey going back into 2024 to create a framework for benchmarking, for assessing and benchmarking companies where they are on their journey away from toxic chemicals to safer solutions. And in creating the survey, we set it up based on 4 pillars of what corporations need to do, right? So they need a management strategy. And I'll say more about each one of these, but they need a strategy, right, to address chemicals beyond compliance. If they're don't have that strategy, right, then they're not going to be doing it. Chemical inventory, they need to know what's in their products. And as as Sheila was just highlighting, you need to know that information all across the life cycle, all the way down to recycling facilities, right? They need to know what's in that product that they're bringing into the facility so they know how to appropriately manage it and also avoid it. Then we advocate for footprint measurement, right, to understand which of those chemicals are hazardous, and then have an initiative to move to safer solutions. And of course, then you need to disclose this information, and that information needs to be verified. So the Chemical Footprint Project has this 4-part assessment of where companies are at on their journey away from toxic chemicals to safer solutions. And as part of the project, what we have done is we have brought together investors, nonprofit organizations, large purchasing organizations like hospitals and retailers to be, advocating for their suppliers, the companies they're engaged for, to be participating in the chemical footprint project, to be measuring their chemical footprint, right? And then committing to goals to reducing that chemical footprint. And so we have investors, signatories representing $3 trillion in assets under management that have signed on to the chemical footprint project survey. We have healthcare and retail signatories that represent over $800 billion in purchasing power. So we've gotten traction from leaders in the investment, healthcare, retail sector space, and they're utilizing the survey as a framework for engaging suppliers or companies they're invested in, to utilize it as a common standard for reporting this information. And we'll talk more about that. And it's also a framework for really identifying who are true leaders in managing chemicals, getting away from chemicals of concern and moving to safer solutions. So this is actually a slide of the value proposition from Hewlett Packard, HP. We asked them, what's their value of participating in the Chemical Footprint Project survey? So they've been participating since we launched it in 2014. And it aligns with the value benefits for this Chemical Footprint Project signatories, right? Align on key performance indicators, prioritize chemicals for action, what we were just talking about, right? Like PFAS as a class. It enables HP to demonstrate leadership and to address stakeholder requests that they get from investors, from consumers, from governments. And I just put this up because, I mentioned earlier, one of the pillars of the Chemical Footprint Project survey is management strategy. And HP has, one of the most robust materials and chemicals policy. And I put the link in here, so when you get the slides, you can go and find this. You can also Google it. But I just wanted to highlight just one of the core elements of their chemical management policy. Determine the hazard characteristics of chemical constituents. Like what Eve was just talking about, like for example with NMP, in its products, packaging, and manufacturing processes. And then use the precautionary approach, right, a hazard-based framework to reduce hazards by replacing chemicals of concern with less hazardous alternatives. So this is this is really important because this is senior management signing off and saying, okay, this is our policy, right, to avoid hazardous, to identify chemicals of concern, and then go and identify safer solutions to them. So that's one example. This is an example from Walmart, and I put this up of a company that's actually been measuring its chemical footprint. I'm going to say more about what a chemical footprint is in the next slide, but Walmart back in 2017 made a commitment to reduce its chemical footprint in formulated products, cosmetics, personal care products, cleaning products by 10% by 2022. And so this was data that was reported out in 2022 that they had calculated up to 2020, and they met their 10% goal. But you can just see, and this is the volume of products sold, represents a reflection of the volume of products sold by Walmart. And these are chemicals, hazardous chemicals, they call them priority chemicals, by weight in products, right? And so they had 216 million pounds in 2017. They reduced it to 180 million by 2020, a 17% reduction. But what's really important, a couple of parts that are really important about what Walmart did was, one, they set the goal. Two, they measured that progress and reported out that progress publicly. And then three, right, they are able to collect and manage this information to be able to actually show that they're reducing their chemical footprint. So, significant amount of work, but I think it's just a really important place, as we say, we want companies to be setting, carbon foot, companies to be net zero or net positive in terms of carbon. We want them to be reducing their biodiversity impacts. And, the chemical footprint approach gives companies a framework for reducing their chemicals. So in our last report, which was released in 2021, the 6th CFP survey, at that point, we had tracked companies reducing chemicals of high concern in products by 83 million pounds, 38 million kilos, which, you're like, well, how much is that? And so there's like, this would be the equivalent weight of 957 Airbus A320 airplanes, right? Just imagine 1,000 airplanes, right? It's a huge volume of chemicals that companies are tracking and measuring their reductions. And again, what we're really trying to drive companies to at least is like get your baseline. So how do we define chemicals of high concern? So we align with the European Union's REACH substances of very high concern definition. I'm not going to read through this. You can see them: carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive and developmental toxicants, etc. You've got PBTs, where like PFAS would be focusing on. And what we just recently did was we created a list and we added PFAS and other chemical classes. So we took the chemicals of high concern, the carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive toxicants, the PBTs, and then we added PFAS, we added all organohalogens, we added parabens, we added bisphenols to this list. And so there's now a comprehensive list of chemicals of high concern. We use the definition of PFAS that states in the United States use, which is the most comprehensive definition. We use the EPA's COMTOX database. So it's 15,000 different PFAS chemistries. All in total, we identified 55,000 chemicals of high concern. And earlier, Lien mentioned that there's 300,000 chemicals used in the battery sector, right? We could take those 300,000 chemicals, we had that list in hand and we could compare them to the list of chemicals on these lists to see, all right, what are the known chemicals, and these are known chemicals of high concern, right? There could be on that 300,000, right? There could be other chemicals of high concern that are unknown, but so now we have a comprehensive list of chemicals of high concern that we've adopted and that companies will be reporting on the next round on this much broader list of chemicals of high concern. So this is I want to explain this chart a bit, but this gets to the data that is collected in the Chemical Footprint Project Survey. So each line, each column here in this graph is a company. And you then have reporting on what's the points that they got in this survey. And chemical inventory, you have 30 potential points. Management strategy is 20 potential points. So it's right, there's going to be less. Footprint measurement is 30 points roughly, and disclosure and verification is 20 points. We've changed the scoring system around a little bit, tweaked it here and there, but roughly maximum of potential 100 points that companies can get. And the companies over here scoring the lowest are companies that typically start off early on in the survey. And these companies, when they participate, are voluntarily participating in the survey. And they really start out with doing the work around chemical inventory. I know I need to move along, but I just wanted to highlight, HP, an electronics company, which be similar, in terms of technology, to a battery company, right? They're one of the top performers, scoring over 90 plus points in the survey. Herman Miller is a furniture company. That's also complex products. You can see where Walmart scores, where Becton Dickinson scores. But the idea as we pivot to doing this for the battery sector, right, would be to have this information to be able to compare companies where they are in the battery sector in terms of going beyond regulatory compliance and to drive them to new places. So companies, when they start on the journey around beyond compliance, they start with a restricted substance list, manufacturing list, RSL, MRSL. Then they go and they try to get all the information around chemicals in their products and supply chains. The next stage is to actually develop a corporate chemical policy. Then they start to take action, measure their footprints, reduce it, and finally, then they're transparent. So transparency is is like the last thing companies are willing to do voluntarily. And so what I've been presenting to you is all voluntary data. What we're doing with the chemical footprint index of manufacturers of batteries used in the renewable energy sector is transitioning to going and creating the questions and scoring them. You can see the comments here. We're working on the questions that we're asking of the companies right now. We will then be scoring the companies in 2025 and making those results publicly available in the second quarter of 2025 is our goal. But something that we're really interested in is what questions would you want companies evaluated on? And I'm going to leave my email address on the last slide, and we could talk about that more, and you can put them in the chat. But we're really interested in what are the questions you're evaluating on, right? We're starting from the work that we've done here. I'm collaborating with Sheila from the work that she's been doing on the solar scorecard, and combining those together to a set of questions we would be asking companies in this sector. So, what are the outcomes that we're really striving for with the chemical footprint index, right? We want to drive these manufacturers to go beyond regulatory requirements. We want to create a third-party framework for companies to assess and evaluate companies in terms of their performance. And this is really important because it provides NGOs, community groups, and investors, and those who are engaging companies in where are you at in these questions that are being asked? Do you have a chemicals management policy? Does your RSL include PFAS? Does your MRSL include NMP, for example, right? You then have a common framework that then is being applied across the sector with the goal of accelerating the movement away from the hazardous chemicals towards safer alternatives, and ideally, right, creating a race to the top in chemical safety. So with that, we're really glad to get some input and ideas on the questions you want to make sure that we include in the index for battery manufacturers. You can reach me at mark@cleanproductionaction.org, and look forward to taking questions. And thank you for your time. I'll pass it back to you, Lien. I'll stop share.
Thank you so much, Mark. Wow, we really went from evening out the gaps in federal law regulation to you setting a much higher bar. Then where do we go from there? Thank you. Now, Krishna, we turn to you to take us to the world of AI and how we can help accelerate the innovation here. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll want to make sure I'm on time here. I know we have a lot of things to cover. So just a bit of background. My name is Krishna Rajan, and in this community, I'm actually working with Mark and Sheila, and we have put together a kind of a consortium of work in connecting the kind of work that Mark and Sheila do with what we do on the academic research side. This is a very unusual collaboration because usually, as those of us who do research in the academic environment, we work with industry, but we rarely get a chance to work very closely with the frontline community. So I'm very privileged to be part of this conversation. And so about 10 years ago, we set up this thing called Collaboratory for Regenerative Economy. My bottom line message, and I'll just say this to you right now, we have to get off fossil fuels. There's no negotiation on that. It has so many bad things we need to deal with. We now need to move into have renewable energy, but we're in a very unique opportunity where the science can help play a role to ensure that the renewable energy is done in a safe and responsible manner. And that's what my bottom line message is. So if I could, am I sharing the screen? Yes. Okay. This slide actually is my whole talk, and I'll this is a slide coming out of a report for H.O. Carson's Southern Spring Anniversary. And many of you may have seen pictures like this. This is taken back in almost 80 years ago. And the obvious issue about this photograph is that the idea that you're spraying DDT and to fight malaria and other diseases, but the fine print, and that's rarely is talked, that's why I've blown up here, is that it says DDT, the powerful insecticide, but harmless to humans. So this is the problem we're trying to deal with. In fact, at the very beginning of this presentation, there was a kind of an inverted triangle, and the top of the triangle was to rethink and redesign. So I'm a material scientist. I think and design about making materials and chemicals from scratch. And my argument is, can we design and rethink our problem from the beginning so that the entire life cycle, we don't have the problems that all of you are trying to contend with. As scientists, we also deal with different stages of that inverted pyramid, but I'm going to focus mainly on where we're doing on the redesign and rethinking. That is where our work and research is at a very different level and different trajectory than 90% of the work that's done out there in trying to deal with this regenerative problem. In the core program that I have with Mark and Sheila, we have three broad core components. I won't read them, but what I'm going to do is talk about what we call the science platform, and basically tell the community I can't solve every problem immediately. It's like I can't get a cure for cancer every time I talk to a patient if I was a doctor, but I can tell you what's possible and with some positive issues of what to do next. So here's what we're looking at. We're trying to understand, and I'll talk about one issue on vocabulary: chemicals versus materials. Those terms are interchanged. There are chemicals used to make materials and process materials. Then the material itself has a chemistry to it, and the science that's involved in studying either side of that equation is very different communities of people. And one of the things we're doing is on the scientific side, we have to bring together communities that normally don't talk to each other. And what we're ultimately interested in is, can we define a material that performs? We don't, otherwise nobody's going to use it, but at the same time mitigate any hazards. And so the balance of sustainability and functionality is a very difficult problem. There aren't any equations for this. There's no such thing as having enough data to solve the problem. And given that right now everything's done by trial and error or by empirical heuristics, and that's why we need some other tools. And that tool is AI. And I know the word AI is used in a very good and bad ways a lot, but I just want to start and use this example in the batteries. And we work on all kinds of problems in my group, but the battery situation is one that obviously is the focus of today's conversation. And when we talk about a battery, I just want to point out, as a material scientist, it's not a homogeneous object. And if you look at, and I'm not going through all the technical terms here, but it is a complex device which has various functions within it. And within those, each functionality of a component of a battery, there are different kinds of materials, different kinds of molecules. We have molecules and materials that are in the organic chemistry space, and the metallurgy space, and the semiconductor space, and in the ceramic space. So when we talk about using these methods to recycle or dismantle, that's like saying, can I take the entire world of solid state matter and try to resolve it in one shot? And the answer is, it's very, very difficult to do so. And we do actually, and the graphics, I'm not going to go through and explain all the details, but we do deal with the remediation question, where we can discover new molecules and new structures that can actually entrap toxic gases or toxic elements. This is looking at these beautiful little pictures, are actually pictures of how atoms are arranged, but the permutation and combinations of discovering this is like coming up with a new drug. The permutation or combinations are endless, and we use AI methods to do so. But here's what I'd like to focus on for this morning's conversation is look at the ecosystem as a whole on both chemicals and materials. And you don't have to know much about chemistry, but you have 100 elements or so on the periodic table to think of every permutation and combination on the material side. On the solid state side is endless. And then at the same time, we have to deal with the manufacturing issues. So we've developed approaches, and we're doing research such that we're not just coming up with solutions and rationales, but try to understand why it works, because having a one case study isn't enough. So I'll quickly go through in the next couple of minutes some examples of the things we work on. We're looking at the area of, for example, safer solvents. What are the physical properties of a solvent that make it toxic, and trying to understand that and using that as a way to screen and understand what you should avoid and what you need to discover. And discovering these properties are not trivial, and there's a lot of computational methods and experimental methods to do so. Another issue that we deal with is we use AI to trace what's going on. So if you look at a chemical, and this diagram here is called a Sankey plot. What it's doing is, on the left-hand side, I have a series of materials that are used in this case for solar cells and also batteries, and that's what the labels are referring to. In the issue of handling and making and synthesizing it and producing it, it uses tons of chemicals of various types that show up as solvents, and each of those solvents has a certain role or functionality in the making of a device in a battery. And there's an endless number of them. And trying to trace that connection requires us to dig into massive amounts of data, literature, which is not organized. And we have AI methods which we do that. Then from there, we condense all that information. We know what molecule, what issues we need to address, and then we can actually work out issues of understanding their impact, a negative or positive in end use. And PFAS has been talked a lot about in this conversation today. One of the issues, and I'd just like to raise, I think, that was talked earlier, is that the definition of PFAS is up to debate. And that has been used as to counter any attempt at regulatory policy and trying to control what needs to be done. And so we confronted that issue by saying we will go in and look at all the PFAS molecules and try to understand, well, how can they be grouped and classified according to the property and structure. Just as a quick statement, naming chemicals is like giving us names. It doesn't tell you anything about the person. And so you look at formulas, you look at labels. Please keep in mind, those are just identifying markers. They tell us little or very little of the bigger picture of why they're dangerous or why they're functional and how they will relate to other molecules. So what we're doing is using the complexity of chemistry and physics and bring that into the AI. And that picture on the top right-hand side is a tree where every dot represents different compounds. And that's us actually going in and telling within this kind of the cartoon on the bottom, what are the branches of every chemical bond that makes it work? And that opens the door for lots of things. And in fact, from full disclosure, the EPA does not support my research, but they have now taken that work, and that is now the algorithms that EPA uses for their regulatory policy. So, and I think we're trying to break down the barriers and create a transparency of data, both for regulatory agencies to pay attention, for the users like you to understand what you should look for, and hopefully companies to adopt. So the conclusion of what I'd like to point out is I see the whole issue of chemicals and materials is not a single-minded issue. And the issue is you have to connect all these issues together. How do you make it? How do you physically make it? And as a compound or a chemistry, how do you manufacture it into some device, whether it be a battery for different applications, or solar cells, or microelectronics, or any of these issues? And ultimately, it's the performance. That is what's going to either sell or make it. That's going to be the commercial and social value of it. But the issue of the sustainability is always looked at after the fact. How do you put that right up front? And that is a very complicated problem, because all the issues that design physics and chemistry to design how to make a functional material, those go in the opposite direction or a different direction if you want to make it sustainable. So you can just well imagine that we now are dealing with so many counteracting features and data and information, and how do you manage that? And that is where the AI comes in. AI is not a panacea, but it's a practical tool to deal with large, messy information. And the human brain is very good at intuition, but it's horribly bad at statistics. And that's really why we use AI. So with that, we want to do things safely. We have to go into renewable energy tourism, but at the same time, we have to make it functional, but we also want to make it safe. So that's my message for this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Krishna. It's challenging to come in at the end with such a wealth of information and data. And thank you so much for shedding this other lens on possible pathways to safer alternatives. We have received a number of questions that if I could invite Sheila as well to join us. So we've collected the questions from the chat shared with us directly as panelists, and then also some I think were shared with everybody. Several of and so we kind of grouped them together. Several of them are about battery recycling. And I invite those of you, if you haven't had a chance yet to ask a question, you're welcome to raise your hand or drop more questions in the chat. But while you're thinking about that and mulling it over, we can start with the ones that Sheila, perhaps I think you can address those, the ones about understanding the toxic impacts of battery recycling, the dangers that these recycling facilities pose, and then also any examples of effective recycling.
Okay, that is a pretty broad and challenging question. with a kind of a quick answer, because the quick answer is that we really don't know the impacts yet. That a lot of these facilities are just starting up. They are, as we mentioned earlier, they're not sharing their data or information about the chemicals that are being used in their process. We know that they are not, some of them are not at scale where they're doing the type of reporting that Eve has outlined for us. And so most of their claims, or most of the information that we can gather, is actually from scientific papers or articles. It's not from the companies themselves so far or from a facility. But we know that there's a lot of chemicals that are used in the process, which is very concerning. For example, and that there are a lot of potential hazards related to the chemicals. So I already mentioned the fire potential. Just in when the battery enters the facility, several battery fires have occurred because of mishandling the batteries on pallets. And so that's a really big concern. We have gotten calls from GAIA members in Detroit saying, what's in the smoke from the batteries? And there's really not clear information available about the impact of the smoke. And then, of course, there's a process called the hydrometallurgy process, which is basically a leaching process that uses a lot of solvents, some of which Eve mentioned that are highly toxic, and some of which that Krishna mentioned that he's trying to determine whether there's safer alternatives for. But basically, they mix that's kind of a chemical soup that they use to break down the battery materials and to recover some of the critical minerals. But there's not a clear understanding of what is the off-gassing, for example, of this chemical mixture, hydrofluoric acid or hydrochloric acid, a lot of really serious solvents as well. And so that's a problem. Is it emitting into the air? Is it emitting into the water? We don't really know. There's really large volumes of water used in the process, but we don't have any information. Most of it's not disclosed about the water quality or the type of materials that are going to hazardous waste landfills. So this is all information that we need to track down, and that hopefully we'll be able to use some of the tools that Eves has suggested and actually petition for this information.
Eve, did you want to add more there, or otherwise we can jump to the next?
Sheila covered it well, thank you.
Thanks, great. We received a question for Mark from one of the participants, Perry Gottesfeld. Do the footprint index companies also include lead acid battery manufacturing or just lithium ion batteries?
Our current focus is on the lithium ion batteries and other storage devices used in the renewable energy economy. So lead acid batteries have not been top of lists currently, but we're open to suggestions about different parts of the battery sector that we should be looking into. We know all the problems with lead acid batteries, which are monumental, especially at the end of life and recycling of them, and of course extracting lead and processing lead at the front end. So we were really focused more on the renewable energy side of the equation.
Yeah.
So the short answer is no, not looking at lead acid batteries at the moment.
Great, thanks. I might jump in with some questions as well, which is do you all know of examples of companies that are making progress towards greater, specific examples of, more automaker or battery manufacturers? As you've been diving into the work, Mark, where you see some promise or what might be some leverage points to get greater access to data, because that has been the theme since the first presentation, and the brunt of Sheila's remarks is how do we get disclosure? What are all of the possible levers, whether it's through regulatory avenues or otherwise? Do you have any lessons from with other industries of ways to get disclosure? What can encourage them for disclosure? Even just to meet regulatory requirements, and then to go beyond that, do you see certain battery manufacturers or car makers? And then the other question was around what we've been hearing today, or what both Eve and then Krishna went to, is defining PFAS and how is the play and industry sabotaging or using that definition in how do we strategically, we meaning environmental justice organizations and allies working towards that, how do we, what are opportunities for us to influence the PFAS definitions in addition to what Eve highlighted under the EPA rules? And I see more coming in. We'll start with those.
Hey, Mark, you're on mute.
Your microphone is muted.
As it should be, but you don't want to hear my dog barking. Hopefully it doesn't start. So in terms, there are companies, for example, that are manufacturing PFAS-free battery systems using different technologies. So we are looking into those. In the chemical footprint index, we will be scoring companies that are publicly traded. So we're really focused on the larger manufacturers in terms of what they are doing in terms of moving to different battery technologies. And part of the process we see of a lot of information won't be publicly available. So we'll score them and then go back to them to say, okay, what are you doing about your restricted substance list? What can you make publicly available, right? To encourage more disclosure. I think the initial work will really be focused on the restricted substances lists and the manufacturing restricted substances lists like PFAS and NMP, and really trying to get the sector at least to go after these low-hanging fruit chemistries, and then to drive them further. So it's going to be it's a process, and getting companies socialized to the idea that they should do more than regulatory compliance is a process, and that's why Alexandra McPherson, who's here today with the Investor Environmental Health Network, will be working with the investment community. We look forward to working with GAIA and the advocacy community on leveraging this information and demanding that companies make more of it publicly available. Did you want me to take on the PFAS definition, or was that sounded like an Eve question?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can say much more. I think if there is advocacy going on about trying to get EPA to shift its definition, I think if we're in a new administration in a few months, I think there, will and should be a really renewed push to get them to modify the definition, and to just, it would be so simple for EPA to adopt the OECD definition, which has been is well vetted and scientifically based. I agree with what Krishna said earlier, that a name is a name. If it's a PFAS or not a PFAS, it still is a chemical that has a particular hazard profile, and that we need to take seriously. And on the other hand, I do think we're seeing that in many states there are restrictions on PFAS as a class with a particular definition of PFAS, and making sure that all of the substances that are used in batteries that are scientifically PFAS are encompassed within state laws that regulate PFAS is an important goal. So I do think it is important to thanks, Mark, to for us to get EPA to update its thinking on the definition, and I think they're keep a lookout. And I think I see in the chat that there's an interest in having some kind of, I don't know if it's a listserv or some way for folks who are part of this conversation to continue to communicate with each other. And if that happens, I'm happy to continue to kind of loop people into advocacy opportunities related to the PFAS definition.
I'll just maybe like to add to that, the problem is that understanding what these chemicals do and what these chemicals are is actually a problem that hasn't been solved. And that is one of the unnerving issues as a scientist, because at one level, a lot of things are being studied about something, but it automatically implies that we know everything about it. So if you want to know what my day-to-day grunge work is to be able to even get this audience, is trying to literally untangle a very complicated knot of millions of compounds. And so we are really approaching this problem as a drug discovery problem. In fact, about 15 years ago, when I was trying to first advocate for this, we advocated, we had an NSF workshop called How Do We Design Safer Batteries Using Drug Discovery as Our Model? And because it's the same kind of problem. Finding a drug to help solve a disease, toxicity is the inverse of that. And so the issues are not just understanding each molecule, but understanding how they interact with other molecules and other materials and other substances. So this is even just as complicated, if not even more than that. So that's the level of kind of full strategy behind our work and philosophy. So I just want to, and that's where we need tools that can help us navigate such massive amounts of uncharted information. And that's what we're doing. So I hope this helps. I think the regulatory policy issue with EPA is they have to at least now come out and say what is the exact definition. They're calling something PFAS, or they're calling a PFAS compound related to another PFAS type compound. We're not giving them wiggle room now. And now they're accepting that, and they're now doing things with it. And we obviously want to do things as well. But I think that's where this kind of work and getting input from your community would help, because we need more genres of information to really drive what we want to do for alternatives.
Thank you both. We're almost at time. We have one more question that was directed to us, which was about if NMP is used in all or most lithium batteries, or just certain chemistries or applications. And Sheila, do you want to go ahead and answer for everybody?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I do see it, at least in reading. It's not like we've asked each company whether or not they're using NMP, but in articles and in our research, we have seen that NMP is used is a key solvent in the battery manufacturing process as well. So it's a process chemical as well as in the recycling process. So it's really used throughout the supply chain there. And it seems to be pretty commonly used as well.
Thank you so much. We are at time. I think going forward, the next steps are, for those of you who have been asking about getting a group together, I encourage you to reach out to Sheila Davis, who is working with Frontline communities in Nevada, and leading the work leading this work for GAIA, and encourage you to follow up with Sheila so that we can continue to share information and build this community together. So with that, I want to thank first and foremost all of the wonderful speakers who joined for sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us. I'd love to thank the interpreters who had a lot of work to interpret in one direction from English to Spanish on a complex topic and many chemical names. So thank you so much to them. I'd love to thank also all of you who came to take time out of your day to learn about this very important topic. And I'd love to thank the host team who helped us at GAIA put this together, Maria and Erica, who, yes, have made all the behind the scenes work possible. So really appreciate all of your energy and interest, and please reach out to me and Sheila for continued information sharing and next steps.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lien.